Hi, I'm Alex and welcome back to another episode of Each week I pick a topic I know a little bit about and we learn about it together. Today we're going to go into one of the strangest and tensest times in modern history, the period we call the Cold War. It's a time when two superpowers, the United States and the former Soviet Union, spent nearly 50 years in a global staring contest, both armed with nuclear weapons and neither side wanting to blink first. Why did this happen? How close did we actually get to nuclear war? And why did so much of modern technology, politics and culture come from this period? So today, we're breaking down what the Cold War was, why it shaped the world we live in today, and how humanity genuinely almost came to an end, with most people never even realizing. The Cold War is one of those terms you hear thrown around at school, in movies, in documentaries, or even your grandparents might have spoken about it. But I realized I barely knew the full story. Why was it called the Cold War? Why were the US and the Soviet Union so against each other? Why does it count as a war if the two sides never actually fought directly? And how did they go from being allies in World War II to suddenly enemies almost overnight? I wanted to unpack the Cold War in a way that actually makes sense, not as a list of dates and treaties, but as a massive story that has real stakes, real danger, and real consequences for the world that we live in today. So let's dive in. I came here today to ask 4 big questions. What actually started the Cold War? What were the major events and crises? How close did we really get to nuclear war? And how did this whole thing finally end? Because the Cold War isn't actually just one event. It's a whole era that affected everything from world politics to space exploration to movies, music, sports, and technology. The Cold War lasted roughly from the end of World War II in 1945 to 1991. It wasn't a traditional war. There was no giant battlefields, no armies charging at each other. Instead, it was a global competition for power, influence, and ideology between the United States, which supported democracy and capitalism throughout the world, whereas the Soviet Union supported communism and authoritarianism. The reason it's called cold is because the two sides never fought each other directly. They fought indirectly through things like proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, nuclear threats, technology races, sports rivalries, and political coups. During World War II, both countries were fighting against the same enemy, which was Nazi Germany. Even though their systems couldn't have been any more different, like American capitalism versus Soviet communism, they put those differences aside because Hitler in the end was a much bigger threat against the both of them. They shared intelligence, coordinated attacks, and even supplied each other with equipment. American factories were pumping out tanks, planes and trucks and shipping them straight to the Soviet army under a deal that was called Lend-Lease. And when the war was at its worst, the Soviets were losing millions of soldiers on the Eastern Front while the US and Britain were fighting in the West. So in a strange way, they both needed each other. But here's the thing. The alliance was always awkward. The two sides never actually trusted each other. They clashed over strategies. They argued over how Europe should look after the war. And deep down, neither side believed the other's political system could peacefully exist long term. Even before World War II ended, the US and the Soviet Union had two completely opposite visions of how the world should work. The US wanted open markets, capitalism, and democratic elections throughout the world. The Soviets wanted socialist revolutions and communist governments worldwide. So as soon as the common enemy was gone, the underlying tension instantly rose to the surface. Western countries aligned with the US, Eastern European countries were forced into the Soviet orbit, and this was how the Cold War officially began. The origins of the Cold War aren't just one event, they're a chain reaction. Cities were destroyed, economies collapsed, millions displaced. The US responded with the Marshall Plan, sending billions to rebuild Western Europe, which obviously made those countries friendlier to America. The Soviet Union saw this as the US just buying allies. Joseph Stalin, who was the head of the USSR at the time, had decided this because they'd been invaded twice in 30 years by Germany both of those times. So Stalin took control of Eastern Europe, installing communist governments throughout, in places like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The US viewed this as Soviet expansion or a threat. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was physically split into a democratic West Berlin and a communist East Berlin. This division would become one of the biggest symbols of the entire Cold War. By 1949, both sides had nuclear weapons, and a year later, both had hydrogen bombs, which are 100 times more powerful than a nuclear bomb. Suddenly, human beings had the power to destroy the planet, and both sides knew it. This is where the Cold War goes from tense to genuinely terrifying. The Cold War wasn't constant action, it was mostly background pressure. But every now and then, something would happen that sent the entire planet into panic mode. And these were those moments.
Out of the story. As the red noose is drawn closer about the western sector of the capital, switches are pulled on generators, and the fuel famine forces drastic power cuts. Berlin becomes a city of darkness, as all ground communication is severed and industry comes.
This was the first major showdown of the Cold War, the moment where things officially stopped being friendly and turned hostile. After World War II, Berlin was split between the Soviets in the east and the Western Allies in the west. The problem was, West Berlin was deep inside Soviet territory, like a little island of capitalism surrounded by communism. And Stalin wanted it gone. So in 1948, he cut off every single road, rail line, supply route going into West Berlin, hoping to starve it into surrender. No food, no fuel, no medicine, nothing. The US and Britain refused to let West Berlin collapse. Instead, they launched the Berlin Airlift.
Standstill. But the Western Allies fight back with an airlift of 450 flights daily, carrying thousands of tons of food into the beleaguered capital, flying an air corridor threatened by Red fighter planes.
One of the wildest logistical operations in human history. For 11 months, planes landed every 45 seconds, delivering coal, bread, milk, and supplies to keep 2 million people alive. Kids would run to pathways to wave at pilots. Some pilots even dropped chocolate bars with tiny parachutes for the children below. Eventually, the Soviets blinked first and lifted the blockade. And the world realized something big. This wasn't just a temporary disagreement. This was going to be a long, global rivalry. Korea became the first boiling point of Cold War tension. After World War II, Korea had been divided into two parts. North Korea, which is backed by the Soviet Union and later China, and then South Korea, which is backed by the US and countries in the West. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South, trying to unify the peninsula under communism. The US and the UN didn't like this very much and sent forces in. China then jumped in on the other side. The fighting was brutal. There were freezing winters, human wave attacks, and trench battles. Millions of soldiers and civilians had unfortunately died in the conflict. By 1953, the war ended exactly where it started. The border had barely moved at all, and the real result, the world realized that the Cold War could turn hot at any moment. This is one of my favorite pieces of history ever. I actually got to visit the wall a couple of years ago, and it was amazing. After the Berlin blockade failed to push the West out of Berlin, the Soviets tried something different. They built one of the most famous and confronting symbols of the entire Cold War, the Berlin Wall. By the early 1960s, millions of people living in East Germany were escaping into West Berlin. They weren't soldiers, they weren't spies, they were just normal families. Workers, teachers, engineers, all leaving because the life under Soviet control was becoming oppressive and just bleak. Every time someone escaped, it wasn't just one person. It was a message. That message was, communism isn't working. So in 1961, without warning, East German soldiers rolled out barbed wire across the city overnight. Families went to bed in the same neighborhood and woke up on different sides of the border. The quick barbed wire fence eventually became a massive concrete wall stretching 155 kilometers around West Berlin and Germany. There were guard towers, searchlights, anti-vehicle trenches, spiked metal fences, and soldiers under strict orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. It became known as the Death Strip, yet people still tried to escape. Around 50,000 managed to make it over the wall, and they did it in some pretty crazy ways. Some people tunneled under it, people got in hot air balloons, they were crashing cars through the checkpoints, they were even tightrope walking. But tragically, more than 100 people were killed trying to flee East Germany. The Berlin Wall turned the Cold War from an abstract global tension into something physically brutal. It wasn't just ideology anymore, it was concrete, separating families for nearly 30 years. And when it finally fell in 1989, it wasn't just a political moment, it was emotional. People smashed at it with hammers, families reunited after decades, and crowds climbed on top of it and celebrated together. It was the moment that the world realized the Cold War was finally coming to an end. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first ever satellite. It was a metal ball the size of a beach ball, but it may as well have been an alien invasion with how the world reacted. The Americans freaked out. If the Soviets could put something in space, they could sure as hell put a nuke there too. US politicians panicked, and they ended up pouring billions into technology and education. Then the Soviets sent the first animal into orbit, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, and the first woman, Valentina Tereshkovka. For the first half of the space race, the Soviets were actually winning. Then the US flipped the script entirely. NASA was created, huge rockets were built, and the country went all in on beating the Soviets. In 1969, the Americans landed the first humans on the moon. That was more than a scientific achievement. It was a victory against the Soviets and a message to the entire world. We have the biggest rockets, the smartest scientists, and the tech to prove it. This is probably the most famous part of the Cold War.
Maintain the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 150 kilometers from Florida. These missiles could have hit Washington or New York in just a matter of minutes. The US discovered them through spy plane photos, and the world changed instantly. Kennedy declared a naval blockade, calling it a quarantine, just to avoid the word war. For 13 days, the world teetered on the edge of destruction. US warships had surrounded Cuba, Soviet ships sailed toward the blockade, nuclear bombers were put on full alert, millions of Americans prepared for possible attack, and leaders in the US had urged Kennedy to invade. One miscommunication, one ship captain panicking, one radar glitch, and the World War could have begun. At the height of this tension, a Soviet submarine captain actually wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo at the US Navy. He was stopped only because another officer of his on board refused to agree. That one man, named Vasily Arkhipov, might have actually saved the world. Eventually, both sides had backed down. The Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and the US secretly agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey. But after that moment, both sides had realized there would never be a winner in nuclear war. The Vietnam War became the Cold War's longest and most painful conflict. The US believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would fall like dominoes. So they poured in money, troops, and weapons to stop this from happening. But North Vietnam, backed by the Soviets and China, had just refused to quit. The war turned into a jungle nightmare. There was guerrilla warfare, booby traps, chemical warfare, and massive casualties. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were killed in the conflict. Over 58,000 American soldiers died, and Australia, South Korea, and others in the region were dragged in as well. After 20 years of fighting, the US eventually withdrew. Saigon fell in 1975, and Vietnam became a unified communist country. The war massively damaged America's confidence and reshaped how the world saw its power. This was also another piece of interesting history to me, because I've actually visited the sites where the Viet Cong had fought, and I promise you, it is terrifying how they'd fought that war. Instead of disarming, both sides did the opposite. They just built more and more nuclear weapons until the number got stupid. By the 1980s, the US had over 23,000 nuclear warheads, and the Soviets had over 40,000. Submarines could wipe out entire countries in minutes. Missiles could hit targets anywhere in the world at Mach 20, and bombs were 100 times stronger than the ones that hit Hiroshima. At this point, they realized something terrifying. If one side launched nukes, the other side would just fire right back, and both would be destroyed. This logic was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. And here's the twisted part. MAD actually prevented war, because both sides knew the first attack would also be their last. The Cold War didn't end with a bang, it slowly unraveled, and here's how. Their system couldn't keep up with the military spending needed to compete with the US. Gorbachev introduced reforms like glasnost, which is more openness, and perestroika, which is rebuilding the economy. He also introduced less censorship and more freedom of speech. But unfortunately, this opened the door for more criticism, and people across Eastern Europe started demanding change. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. These all began resisting Soviet control. This becomes the defining moment. Crowds tear down the wall, families reunite, and Germany is whole again. The 15 republics in the USSR, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, ended up becoming sovereign nations, and the Russian Federation emerged as a successor state. And just like that, the Cold War comes to an end. Today would look very different without the Cold War. The Cold War left behind things that we see today, like NATO, the United Nations structure, the modern borders of Europe, the nuclear weapons we still worry about, space technology, and basically the entire geopolitical system layout that we see on the news. Even current conflicts and tensions throughout the world have Cold War fingerprints and remnants all over them. This era made me realize something. Sometimes the scariest threats aren't loud or obvious. They're silent, slow, and hidden behind political speeches and secret decisions. For nearly 50 years, humanity lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons, proxy wars, espionage, and a constant competition for influence. And yet we managed to pull back from the edge time and time again. Weirdly still, out of all that tension came some of humanity's biggest achievements, such as space travel, global communication, and the technology that we get to use every single day. Friends, is the Cold War. A quiet, complicated, and surprisingly creative struggle that defined the entire second half of the last century. Thanks for being here today. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next week where we'll get the chance to learn about another topic. Bye for now.